Greetings, this is the Grumpy Old Slan, and today we're going to be looking at the April 1924 issue of Weird Tales. They still have the table content way at the end, and this is where we see that we have 18 stories. We also have one poem by H.P. Lovecraft that's listed here. Seabury Quinn is back with his Weird Crimes column. What is missing is the eerie, the letters column, which seems to be replaced by the Ask Houdini, where people would write in questions. So let's get into it. And the first story is The Hoax of the Spirit Lover by Houdini. So this one is all about Houdini, who is asked to debunk a medium, which of course he does with the help of an associate. While the seance starts, the lights are turned off, but his associate has a flashlight. He suspects that the person who will pretend to be a spirit, which they do by painting some glow-in-the-dark makeup on their face and sneaking into the room when the lights are off. While he's busy figuring out how this person comes in, his associate will turn on the flashlight, and lo and behold, in the light of the flashlight, one of the attendees recognizes him. She thinks it's her dead husband, but no, it turns out the dead husband is a twin. But no, it turns out the twin was sick and switched places with the husband so that when he died, the husband, having taken his brother's place, can collect on the life insurance and disappear into thin air, leaving his fiancée out to dry in the process. Of course, it all ends well with the charlatans getting arrested for fraud and another one of those very unlikely stories that is claimed to be true. It's one of those weird, these are twins and there's confusion. We still see stories like that today, and maybe 100 years ago it was new and original, but today it's very tiresome. The next story is Ebenezer's Casket by J.U. Giese and Junius B. Smith. This is a story of a man who knows when exactly he will die, and it's the story of his last day. He finishes work early, tells his boss he's not going to be back and why, to his boss's disbelief, goes to a lawyer to make arrangements, goes to a funeral home, and so forth. They, of course, all disbelieve him or think he wants to kill himself, which he assures them he doesn't want to do. He then decides he will go to a hospital because he feels a hospital is a nice, quiet place that will be a good place to die. They take him in, examine him, take a blood sample, and all of a sudden the doctor returns, suspects he swallowed something to kill himself because it's almost the time he said he would be dying. They shove a tube down his throat, and they're basically gonna empty out his stomach with the idea of saving him. There's maybe 5 minutes, 6 minutes for him to live, and we are going to find out what happens in the next issue of Weird Tales when the story concludes. The story of a apparently down-to-earth person who takes an extraordinary fact in a quite down-to-earth way, and the conflict that arises with all the people he says this to. Bit of a cliffhanger at the end, but that's what you want in those two-parter stories. So I quite liked this one. It was fun. This is followed by The White Ape by H.P. Lovecraft. This is mostly the story of the protagonist's family, who going back several generations were very interested in anthropology. His great-great-great-grandfather was one of the earliest explorers of the Congo region, brought back a lot of artifacts. Some of his descendants studied these and also went to Africa. They talk about some sort of lost city that belonged to white apes. Examining the artifacts and having made arrangements for an artifact from this city to be sent to him in England. When he receives it, he realizes that his great-great-great-grandfather had brought back a woman from this city and that he is not entirely human, and this causes him to want to kill himself. I found this relatively disappointing as an H.P. Lovecraft tale. One of problems, I think, is he's very built up in our imagination as the creator of the entire Cthulhu mythos. So when we see a story that's very much a standard weird tale stories, it feels slightly disappointing. But at the same time, I can see why the magazine built it as H.P. Lovecraft at his best, because this is very much the kind of story at this point that they publish. Next, we have Down Through the Ages by Rex Hall. This is one of those tales of an archaeologist bringing back a mummy. There's a curse associated with it, because of course there is, and he will succumb to that curse. I've seen better stories with that theme, though I can't blame it for being badly written. It's not at all. It's fairly well written. Not a complete waste of time, but also not a very memorable story. Next, we have The Great Adventure by Brian Irvine. This is about a writer who's very popular and has a very distinctive style. It is narrated by the editor of a magazine who has published some of the writer's stories. At first, it seems the writer is channeling some ancient spirit who is doing the actual writing while he just acts as a medium for this spirit. But then it seems that maybe that's not the case. I found it a little bit confusing, hard to track exactly what's going on. It was a little bit disappointing in that sense. Next, we have Tragedy Island by J.M. Alvey. In this one, the narrator talks about an old college friend who has inherited a house on a remote island called Tragedy Island. The last 6 owners, so the last 6 generations of the narrator's friend, have all died there. It's reported to be haunted. The narrator will visit his friend there once in a while he is surprised at his friend's decision to remain there permanently. He keeps visiting, a few weekends a year type thing. After a long absence, he gets in touch and says, "Oh, I'd like to come over like I used to," and he's told he'll be welcome. When he gets to the coast, normally the gardener would come picking him up in a boat. He sees the boat, but no one comes. So as night falls, he decides he's gonna do the crossing himself. When he gets to the house, he sees his friend who's in very bad shape. He says the staff all ran away and left him there alone. So the next morning, he hears some noise, discovers that the boat has been taken away, leaving him stranded on the island. His friend doesn't appear to be anywhere. Luckily, some of the staff have decided to come back in the morning. They see him, and then they hear the motor of the boat coming back, and this is where they see the body of the friend with a bullet hole in his forehead. Not much to this story. It doesn't feel like there's any haunting. It doesn't feel like there's anything actually weird. It's just a story of somebody, for no clear reason, does away with himself. Very disappointing story, if you ask me. Next is The Brown Mouse by Edward Parrish Ware. This is all narrated in the first person, and the narrator seems to be rather unreliable. He seems to be suffering from hallucinations. First part of the story is him trying to catch up with someone, never quite managing to. When he finally does, it's himself, but a younger self. And then he has all these separate, disconnected episodes. But we are told at one point that he gets a visit from a friend who's an editor in a magazine. We find out that the narrator is a writer, but he's letting his lifestyle, alcohol is mentioned, get in the way of his talent. In these various visions he has, or maybe they're actual things that happen to him, he will see a woman who he will refer to as the Brown Mouse. He finds a letter from her. He tries to find where she is. He comes out of his apartment. Down the hallway, he sees an open door, and he goes and he finds hanging there the woman in question. The most interesting part about this story was the unreliableness of the narrator, where we're not quite sure what is real, what is a hallucination he's having. A good weird tale, better than the previous one. Next is Exhibit A by Anne Harris Hadley, which I've already read, and I'm going to put a link for that one in the description so you don't need to rely on my recapping, but which I quite liked. Very much of its time, flight is still new. People didn't know how the upper atmosphere went, really, how far up it went, and things like that. So that's what it's sort of based on. It's a bit science fiction-y that way, though to modern readers, it'll read more like fantasy. I really like this one. Then we finally have the last installment of The Transparent Ghost by Isabel Manzer. I've already said that I couldn't read this and this is just as bad. I'm going to skip this one, and I'm just happy this is finally over, and I do hope we find nothing else by this writer in future issues. Next we have The Devil Bird by Hal Albert. This one about a young man who feels he's not paid enough by his employer and will start to garnish his wages by embezzling some money. Eventually he is caught, will go to prison. After purging his time, he decides he will get his revenge. And what he will do is he will get a job for his employer's brother. And what he wants to do is steal the content of the safe that will contain some money, but also some gems and whatnot. The employer has a black parrot that will ask for peanuts, which he dislikes, and eventually, though, he finally will be able to get the combination to the safe. He will start plundering the safe. His employer will catch him in the act, upon which he will knock him unconscious, perhaps dead, he's not sure. He will then lock the employer in the safe and leave. The next morning, show up at work as though nothing was out of the ordinary. And the police is there because some people are wondering where his employer is. He will ask someone else who has the combination, could you open the safe so I can do some work? Of course, they find the body. And at that point, the parrot will repeat the dying words of the employer as he was screaming for mercy. I couldn't help but think of that Far Side cartoon where we see the parrot with somebody lying either dead or unconscious, and the parrot's just going, hello, hello, anybody home? It was hard for me to get into this is eerie and weird when all I could think of was this funny cartoon. Next, we have the final installment of Coils of Darkness by Sibla Ramis. So in the last installment, the young couple have decided to go back to England, bringing back the snakes that are the source of her addiction. They will try to find a way for her to get rid of this problem. However, she soon becomes entranced by the social life, becomes quite the social butterfly, going from reception to reception and tea party to tea party, dismissing her husband who's trying to say, look, we have to do something about your problem. Eventually, the husband is so stressed and worried, and all of this adds up to him becoming sick himself. He finally starts to recover. There's a big event with royalty, which they both have to go to. She will fall unconscious. He will bring her home post haste, bring some doctors in. He will also find out that because of the colder climate, the snakes have died. So her craving has not been satisfied. The doctors are trying to do their best for her, but she's not getting better. And eventually they think, okay, well, from the zoological gardens, through a connection, I can get some of the snakes. However, they won't bite. So they killed one snake to extract the venom. Clearly, this person doesn't know how you extract venom from a snake. You don't need to kill it at all. However, it is too late, and the story ends with the curse having taken its full course and the young lady having passed away. This was a fun and interesting story. There was some good characterization, a good little serial here. Next, we have The Spirit Fakers of Hermannstadt by Houdini. This is part 2 of the story started in the previous issue. As you may recall, he'd managed to escape, because of course he did, He knows word has been sent to the village of what's happening in the castle. He debates fleeing or returning, but he is worried about the countess who had asked him for help, and so he returns into the castle, sneaks back in the process managing to knock out one of the guards and tie him up. He then finds that the people who were using his name are running a fake seance, trying to still get the countess to write down and sign evidence against her family. This leads to a confrontation. When all seems lost, a group of villagers arrive and they manage to either capture or run off the charlatans. All's well that ends well. And of course, if you're in for a penny, you have to go in for a pound. The one who managed to escape turns out to be someone Houdini, quote unquote, suspects of being none other than Rasputin, the Mad Monk. Very over-the-top adventure tale, mostly because it's presented as something that actually happened to Houdini, which clearly it didn't. I might actually have enjoyed it more had it been presented as simply an adventure tale. Next, we have the latest installment of Draconda by John Martin Leahy. This is, I believe, the fifth installment. At this point, they've finally reached the court of Queen Draconda on Venus. One of them, however, is sick. They'd found out she spoke English. She was going to reveal why. And this is where I just couldn't get into this one episode. A lot less happens. The one character who was ill, when he finally wakes up and sees her, literally dies of shock. Apparently he knew her in a different life, though she claims to not have been on Earth. Most of the rest of the story, I think it's 10 pages of this, is stretching out her not saying how come she knows English. She claims to be 25 years old, but also 125, and that it's an obvious reason why. It just really wore at my patience. It really feels like one of those, oh, you're paying me by the word, I will supply you words. Never mind that the plot isn't really going anywhere, which is a bit frustrating considering the start, which was quite action-packed. This is a very disappointing episode of this serial. I'm hoping that the conclusion, which is promised in the next issue, will redeem this. The next story is Sport for Ladies by Stanley G. Thompson. This was a rather disappointing story about two prisoners who escaped from prison. They're quite different people. The one who initiated the project had no choice but to get his cellmate in on it. They get into conflict, and the second man will eventually kill the first one. And that's really all there is to say about this one. You keep sort of expecting more to it, but there isn't. This is followed by The Man Who Dared to Know by Junius B. Smith. This is the tale of a man who has finally managed to compile a complete history of his family, the complete genealogy, all the way down to himself. Being unmarried, he knows this is not going to continue. Someone appears in front of him and says he can help him increase the story of his ancestors even more. He has access to knowledge normal archives don't have. This person will show him visions of different ancestors. This is going to keep going throughout the night until in the early hours of the morning, he says, you haven't shown me my parents. Upon which he is shown a vision of two very poor people who have a child but who cannot take care of it and who will give it up for adoption. The people he thought were his parents were merely his adoptive parents. He now feels his achievement of compiling this whole genealogy to be unimportant. It's lost all meaning for him. Slightly disappointing. It's hinted at in some ways that the gentleman with the extra knowledge might be the devil, but nothing happens other than the revelation of the fact that the main character has been adopted and he didn't know it. The build-up is nice, it's just that the denouement is kind of a letdown. And it's followed by The Ghost Eater by C.M. Eddy Jr. As the title implies, this is a ghost story, fairly standard one of a traveler delayed in the woods who comes across a house where he is made welcome, given a place to sleep. He feels his host is a little bit odd and he is worried, so instead of just going straight to bed, he arranges his clothes on the bed to make it look like someone's sleeping and sits on a chair behind the door where he won't be seen. Not too long after, he hears footsteps and this large figure, who is not the host, comes in and goes to bed. When he tries to shake the person awake, his hand goes right through the person and he witnesses this ghost getting murdered. When he gets to his destination, he finds out that many years before, there'd been a murder there, and some people suspect that the killer was like a werewolf or something like that. A fairly standard story, not badly told, but also nothing unusual about it either. Next is The Thing by Frank Marion Palmer. This is the short tale of a man who goes on a business trip. The room he's in, he has some nightmares. He's not sure why. He's visited by something. He saw something. And in the morning, he just leaves as quickly as he can without telling anyone what he witnessed. He reads in the paper that there was a suicide at the hotel. However, no one heard anything because there were only 2 rooms occupied, and the authorities are looking for him in regards to what happened in that room. This really didn't do much. That was a very disappointing story, which is, however, followed by a lovely poem by H.P. Lovecraft called Nemesis, which I really enjoyed. Next is Shadows by Frank Owen. This one starts with the main character crouching in stairs in the darkness. He's a murderer. He got arrested. After his trial, where he is found guilty, be condemned to death. However, while he makes his escapes and he's haunted by what he's seeing, he's apparently always been haunted by shadows. He will empty the pistol into the shadows to prevent whatever he thinks is coming from showing up, and use the last bullet on another target, namely himself. Once that's all done, out of the shadow comes a black cat. Again, nothing particularly interesting in this one for me anyway. And this is followed by a Seabury Quinn article on weird crimes. This one going over the story of Mary Blandy, who poisoned her father with arsenic. I know there is some historicity to this story, but some of it seems to be told in a very fictionalized way. He adds details, namely, for example, that a young boy who was a bully when she was younger and who she hit turns out to be one of the bailiffs in the court or something like that. This is a kind of fictional detail that makes me just step out of the story, even though I do know that Mary Blandy was a real person who actually did kill her father using poison. We don't have any Eerie in this issue. However, we do have a letters column. This one is called Ask Houdini, where people wrote in questions for him to answer, mostly about spiritualism, seances, and things like that. His attitude seems to be, I'm not convinced that it is false, but I've never seen one that is true, and I've tried to investigate as many of them as I could. He will encourage people to use some well-placed incredulity and a little bit of the scientific method to see if what appears to be supernatural is not just something somebody set up to appear that way. And he explains some of the tricks that people might use in order to do so. This has been the Grumpy Old Sland, looking at the April 1924 issue of Weird Tales, and I'll see you next time.